July 18th, 1944. The sky above St. Lo burned red with dust and smoke. Deep within dugouts carved into the French countryside, young German auxiliaries crouched, clutching their headsets and message pads as the earth trembled beneath them. They had been told the Reich's armies would hold. They had been promised that German technology, German resolve, and German faith in the Führer would repel any invader. But as the hours dragged on, the thunder outside told a different story. The sound was not distant artillery. It was closer, heavier, more relentless. It was the rumble of America's Sherman tanks, hundreds of them, grinding forward with a force that seemed endless. To the Flak the female auxiliaries manning radios and field telephones, it felt as though the very earth itself had chosen a side. The girls were barely out of school, their hair still braided beneath steel helmets too large for their heads. Some had grown up in Berlin, Dresden, or Hamburg, now reduced to rubble by Allied bombers. Others had been farm daughters, drafted into service through the Reichsarbeitsdienst, told they were serving the fatherland by freeing men for the front. Now, in Normandy, they faced a war they had never imagined. Steel monsters rolling through hedgerows, their treads crushing stone walls, their machine guns raking every movement. From their dugouts, they heard it all. The clank of armor, the shouts in English, the orders barked in German to retreat or regroup. Every transmission they relayed carried the weight of disaster. A panicked officer's voice crackled through the lines. "Shermans! Too many! They don't stop, day or night." The auxiliaries scribbled furiously, passing the words down the chain of command. One girl's hand trembled so violently that her pencil snapped. She pressed her palm against the table to steady it, whispering under her breath, "How do they never sleep?" Above ground, anti-aircraft guns barked as Allied fighter-bombers strafed roads clogged with retreating German units. The Luftwaffe Flak women trained to spot enemy planes, tracked the P-47 Thunderbolts as they swooped down in support of the tanks. Their orders were to protect the sky, but their weapons could not touch the armor grinding across the fields below. Some of the young women covered their ears against the deafening blasts. Others forced themselves to keep writing, keep transmitting, keep serving. They had no rifles to shoulder, no grenades to throw, yet they were bound to the war effort as tightly as the soldiers bleeding outside their bunkers. The paradox of their existence hung in the smoke-filled air. They were soldiers without weapons, warriors without power, tasked with sustaining a machine of war that was already collapsing. And as they listened, they realized the unthinkable. The Reich's promises of invincibility had been illusions. The Americans had brought something Germany could not match, an army of machines that rolled forward without rest, supplied by factories an ocean away that seemed to produce tanks as endlessly as waves breaking on a shore. Through the night, the ground shook. Each hour brought fresh reports of shattered units, overrun positions, bridges destroyed, and towns lost. The auxiliaries scribbled messages with numb hands, their faces lit by lanterns flickering in the darkness. They had been told they would be safe in support roles, far from danger. But here, the front lines had swallowed them whole. One nurse, working alongside the communications staff, pulled back the canvas flap of the dugout to bring in a wounded soldier. His uniform was blackened with soot, his arm torn open. She whispered to him as she pressed bandages against his wounds. "Hold on. Just hold on." The tanks roared closer, her words drowned in their thunder. By dawn, the realization was complete. The Reich had demanded their youth, their obedience, their faith. In return, it gave them rubble, retreat, and an enemy that never seemed to tire. The promise of German superiority had shattered under the relentless advance of America's war machine. And for these women, crouched in dugouts or standing beside radios, the truth came too late. The Reich they had been taught to serve was crumbling before their eyes, and no message, no coded order, No act of loyalty could halt the steel tide that never slept. The thunder of St. Lo fades, and the story rewinds to the years before those dugouts shook. Across Germany, classrooms emptied as the Reich demanded its young. The war on the Eastern Front consumed men at a pace the nation could not replenish. By 1943, entire divisions were shadows of their former strength, and the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe turned to women to fill the gaps. Some were drafted through the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the compulsory labor service that had once meant harvesting fields or clearing rubble. Now, Rady uniforms became the first step toward military postings. Others volunteered, lured by propaganda posters that painted service as noble sacrifice. The posters showed smiling girls with rifles slung across their shoulders or gazing skyward through binoculars, their hair tucked neatly under caps. The slogans promised honor, duty, and belonging. Few suspected the reality waiting at the front. Training camps turned civilians into auxiliaries. The Luftwaffe Flak schools drilled them in discipline and mechanics. They memorized codes and practiced map reading late into the night. In open fields, they learned to track the silhouettes of Allied aircraft, tracing their movements with spotting scopes as instructors barked corrections. At gunnery posts, they loaded ammunition belts into anti-aircraft guns, the recoil shuddering through their arms. To some, it felt empowering. To others, it felt terrifying. The contrast was sharp. Just months before, many of these women had been teenagers who gathered for school dances or sang in church choirs. Their diaries spoke of crushes, books, and dreams of travel. Now they shouldered the weight of a collapsing empire. One remembered writing in her journal, "I traded my textbooks for signal flags, my classroom for a barracks. I am 20 years old, and I feel already much older." The Reich blurred the line between civilian and combatant. Officially, these women were auxiliaries, helpers, not fighters. But the war cared little for definitions. Telephone operators in forward posts relayed orders while shells rained around them. Clerks in field headquarters recorded casualty lists that grew longer each day. Medics in clearing stations stitched wounds under flickering lanterns, their white aprons soaked crimson by dawn. And the Flakhelferinnen, who were told they were only spotters, often found themselves directly beside the gunners, calculating trajectories and pointing skyward as Allied bombers darkened the horizon. There was pride, at first. Pride in the uniform. Pride in the sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. A young auxiliary recalled standing in line during roll call, the sergeant shouting, "Für das Vaterland!" and the chorus of voices answering back. She wrote, "We believed we were unbreakable, that our service made us equal to the soldiers. But as the months passed, the truth pressed harder. Letters from home brought news of cities reduced to ash. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, all were scarred by firebombing. Families were scattered, brothers lost at the front, fathers never returning from Russia. The girls who had once run barefoot through summer meadows now pressed their hands against trembling radio sets, relaying the orders of men who had run out of answers. The paradox deepened. They had been called to support life in a nation waging total war, yet their very presence extended that war's machinery. They were hailed as guardians of the Reich's defenses, but carried none of the protection soldiers received. No rifle slung across their backs, no chance to resist the tanks that would one day overrun their posts. Their duty was to observe, to record, to transmit, and to endure. For many, the first true taste of war came not from the front lines, but from the skies. Allied bombers swept across Germany in waves, their engines like rolling thunder. In bunkers, the auxiliaries sat with headphones pressed to their ears, marking positions, tracking patterns. Outside, bombs fell with mechanical precision, shaking the very ground of the fatherland they had sworn to serve. One remembered whispering to her friend in the dark, "They never rest. They come by day, by night. How can we ever stop them?" What began as youthful idealism was eroded by exhaustion, by fear, and by the creeping realization that the Reich's promises were empty. Yet still they served. They marched to their posts, polished their boots, and carried out orders, because not to serve was unthinkable. They were no longer schoolgirls, but neither were they soldiers. They were caught in the in-between, pressed into a war that demanded everything and returned nothing. This was the world that led them to St. Lo. The journey from classrooms and dances to dugouts and radios traced not only their lives, but the trajectory of Germany itself, a nation that had promised glory, only to deliver ruin. The thunder of Normandy did not fade with nightfall. For German auxiliaries huddled in command posts and listening stations, the war no longer came in sudden clashes, but as an unbroken tide. Every report confirmed the same grim reality. The Americans never stopped. The U.S. Army's doctrine was built on momentum. M4 Sherman tanks rolled forward, not in isolation, but in endless formations, accompanied by supply trucks, engineers, artillery, and columns of infantry. Behind them stretched convoys that seemed to have no end. Petrol, ammunition, spare parts, even prefabricated bridges. The women of the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht, tasked with transcribing and relaying field reports, became silent witnesses to the machine that ground their nation down. Messages arriving from the front told of villages swallowed in hours. A town that existed on Monday might be gone by Tuesday, its name crossed out in dispatches and replaced with coordinates of destroyed bridges and burning rail yards. A young communications auxiliary in Brittany scrawled in her notebook, "We were told the Reich was stronger, but every night we write down losses. Every night they advance again." For German commanders, fuel was measured in desperation. Tanks sat idle for lack of petrol. Horses pulled artillery where trucks once did. At the same time, the Americans landed one ship every 15 minutes at Cherbourg and Omaha, unloading supplies at a pace the Reich could not hope to match. The auxiliaries knew the numbers because they processed them, their typewriters clattering with casualty figures, destroyed units, and pleas for reinforcements that never came. In field hospitals behind the lines, the imbalance was measured in flesh. Nurses treated endless streams of wounded from tank engagements outside Caen and St. Lo. Limbs shattered by high-explosive shells, burns from flaming fuel tanks, lungs torn by shrapnel. One nurse remembered pressing a cloth to a soldier's chest as he gasped, whispering, "They never sleep." "How can we stop men who never sleep?" She could not answer him. Above the battlefields, the sky belonged to the Allies. Bombers droned overhead, their contrails marking the heavens like scars. Flak Helferinnen, female auxiliaries trained to track aircraft, stood at their spotting posts with binoculars and plotting boards. Their hands shook as they called out headings, watching the bombers release payloads that roared earthward to shatter supply depots and convoys. It was their duty to mark trajectories, but even as they did, they knew the barrages seldom slowed the tide. In diaries later recovered, a recurring theme emerged: disbelief. The Reich had promised technological superiority, Panther tanks, V-weapons, jet fighters. But these marvels were few and late, while the Americans produced Shermans by the tens of thousands. "For every one we knock out," a gunner confided to an auxiliary, "5 more come." She carried his words back to her bunk that night, unable to sleep. The shock was not just mechanical, but human. GIs rotated through the lines with a regularity that astonished their enemies. Fresh divisions replaced exhausted ones, while German units held the front until they collapsed. To the young women logging reports, it seemed as if the Americans had an inexhaustible army. One wrote bitterly in the margin of her notebook, "They send more men in a month than we can train in a year." The paradox deepened. These women had no rifles, no means to fight back, yet they were bound to the war's machinery through the words they typed. the signals they relayed, the maps they updated with red pencil strokes inching closer to their own positions. Each message was a reminder that the Reich was shrinking, not expanding. Even propaganda began to ring hollow. Posters still proclaimed victory, but reality came through the headset and the ward doors. Nurses saw boys of 16 carried in with terrible wounds, while auxiliaries heard panicked voices over the line as divisions reported being overrun in the night. The Reich had promised superiority. What they witnessed was collapse under the weight of industrial war, and still they continued their work. Orders were followed, reports sent, patients treated. To stop was unthinkable, but in their eyes grew the knowledge that America's tanks, fed by factories an ocean away, truly never slept. The Reich's borders shrank with every passing week of 1944. Retreat was no longer a maneuver, but a daily reality. And the young women who had once manned telephones, decoded signals, or spotted aircraft now found themselves swept along in the same tide as exhausted Wehrmacht units. Orders came abruptly. Burn the files, smash the radios, destroy anything that could aid the advancing Allies. For many auxiliaries, their last duty to the Reich was not service, but erasure. Flames consumed ledgers and maps, the smoke rising like a final confession of defeat. In the confusion of retreat, they became stragglers on crowded roads, columns of soldiers, civilians, and carts all moving westward under the thunder of Allied artillery. Some women marched beside armed units, others fell behind, abandoned in makeshift dugouts as commanders fled. Capture was inevitable. When American or British troops overtook them, they faced a new reality. Uniforms without weapons still marked them as part of Hitler's war machine. The Geneva Convention offered clarity for nurses. They were recognized as non-combatants, entitled to protection. But female auxiliaries, clerks, typists, flak spotters, occupied a gray zone. To Allied soldiers, they were not quite civilians, not quite combatants, and suspicion shadowed them. Rumors spread quickly. Were they spies? Did they carry secret codes? Some were interrogated harshly, accused of hiding intelligence in their diaries or uniforms. Hunger and fear became their daily companions, the certainty of their futures slipping away with every day behind barbed wire. Within prisoner of war camps, the paradox deepened. The same young women who had typed casualty reports now tended to the casualties themselves. Improvised infirmaries were staffed not only by captured army medics, but also by these auxiliaries who clung to their basic medical training as a lifeline. They cleaned wounds, rationed bandages, and soothed fevered soldiers who had once stood guard over them. One recalled being asked by a wounded Feldwebel, "Fräulein, will you stay until I sleep?" She sat beside him until dawn, though he never woke again. Conditions in the camps varied. Some were placed under Red Cross supervision, where rations and medical oversight brought a measure of relief. Others languished in improvised enclosures, their daily bread a crust barely enough to survive. Diaries spoke of gnawing hunger, lice infestations, and the constant uncertainty of when or if they would be released. Yet even here, routines emerged. Women shared scraps of soap, patched each other's clothing, and whispered prayers at night. The vulnerability of their position was stark. Unlike male POWs who were processed as soldiers, female auxiliaries often faced curiosity, hostility, or even harassment from their captors. They were young, many barely in their 20s, and their uniforms marked them with a stigma they could not shed. Survival required resilience and solidarity. They leaned on one another, forming small circles of trust that carried them through interrogations and hunger alike. For some, captivity became a moment of bitter clarity. The promises of the Reich, the certainty of victory, the glory of sacrifice, lay in ruins around them. What remained was survival, stripped of illusions. "We were taught we defended the fatherland," one auxiliary later confessed. But in the end, we defended only ourselves, with empty hands. The collapse of the front and the capture of these women mirrored the disintegration of Germany itself. Their journey from dugouts and bunkers into the barbed wire of Allied camps traced the fall of a nation that had gambled everything and lost. The Reich's propaganda machine had made them symbols of youthful service. Captivity revealed them as survivors of a war that consumed its children. Yet even in defeat, a paradox lingered. They were prisoners, yet they still healed. They had lost their place in Hitler's crumbling empire, yet they found a fragile purpose in tending to the wounded, in keeping life alive amid ruin. Their captivity became a bridge to the aftermath, a world where the war was over, but its shadows would follow them long after the guns fell silent. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the war did not simply end for the women who had served the Reich. For many, it dissolved into a silence more suffocating than the roar of artillery. Those who returned home stepped into landscapes barely recognizable. Cities reduced to skeletal ruins, streets choked with rubble, and families scattered by death or displacement. The uniforms they once wore with discipline now carried a stigma. In some towns, female auxiliaries were greeted not as survivors, but as collaborators. Whispers followed them through market squares, accusations lingered at ration lines, and many learned to conceal their service to avoid shame. The paradox was cruel. These women had seen the Reich's facade unravel from within, propaganda speeches collapsing under the relentless grind of Allied tanks, maps blackened with retreats, hospitals overflowing with broken young men. They knew how hollow the promises of invincibility had been, and yet their knowledge was rarely welcomed. Post-war Germany sought simple narratives: soldiers as fighters, generals as architects of defeat. The stories of women at switchboards, in dugouts, or tending wounds at the rear were too complex, too uncomfortable, too fit. For nurses who had once bandaged torn limbs under candlelight in collapsing field hospitals, the silence was heavier still. They carried visions of the wounded whose screams echoed long after the wards had emptied. Nightmares revisited them, the smell of antiseptic and blood mingling, the endless cries for water, the whispers of dying men asking for letters to mothers who would never read them. One recalled in her diary, "I can still hear the tanks. Even in the quiet, they rumble through my dreams." In West Germany, the economic miracle of the 1950s demanded optimism and reconstruction, not remembrance. Former auxiliaries blended back into civilian life, becoming clerks, nurses, or housewives. Few spoke of what they had endured, afraid of judgment or dismissal. In East Germany, their stories were shaped by another narrative, portrayed as victims of fascism or tools of a corrupt regime, their individuality erased in favor of political myth. Yet fragments of their voices survived. In memoirs written late in life, in taped oral histories recorded before memory faded, these testimonies reveal an extraordinary truth. They had understood, perhaps earlier than most, the futility of the war they served. Watching Allied convoys stretch across the horizon, feeling the ground quake beneath American armor, seeing hospital wards filled with boys younger than themselves, they knew the Reich was broken. One woman admitted decades later, "We realized too late that we were only helping prolong the inevitable." Their silence was not weakness, but a form of endurance. It allowed them to rebuild, to marry, to raise children in a Germany desperate to forget. But in private, they remained haunted witnesses to defeat. They carried the memories of both destruction and compassion. The burned villages, the endless flow of wounded, the fleeting moments of humanity they had salvaged from ruin. In the shadows of history, their roles remained ambiguous, neither heroes nor villains, neither fully soldiers nor simply civilians. But their testimonies, uncovered with time, shed light on a generation caught between loyalty and survival. They remind us that war is not only fought in the clash of armies, but in the lives of those who carried its weight long after the final shots were fired. Their silence was not emptiness, it was a ledger of memories, unspoken but unforgotten. And through their quiet endurance, they became witnesses not only to the collapse of a nation, but to the cost of believing in its false promises. By the war's end, memory became the battlefield where German female auxiliaries wrestled with what they had witnessed. From their posts in communication centers, hospitals, and anti-aircraft batteries, they had watched the United States unleash an industrial war effort unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago produced tanks, trucks, and aircraft at a pace so overwhelming that German officers nicknamed it the conveyor belt of death. The Sherman tank, once mocked in Nazi propaganda as inferior, became a symbol of ceaseless pressure. For the women who recorded dispatches or bandaged soldiers from shattered panzer divisions, the realization struck late but deeply. The American war machine never slept. One remembered standing by a field telephone near the ruins of Caen. Through the crackle of the line came the voice of a panicked officer. "They keep coming, day and night. We destroy one, 10 more arrive. Where do they find them all?" She later wrote that the words never left her, the moment she knew the Reich could not win. The paradox of their service sharpened in hindsight. These women were not frontline soldiers, yet they bore witness to the front lines collapsing. They saw towns vanish under bombardments, convoys of tanks stretching across the horizon, hospitals overflowing with broken youth. Their diaries reveal astonishment as well as despair. Promises of German technological superiority disintegrated under the relentless tide of Allied production. The auxiliaries also began to recognize how their own roles had blurred the boundaries between civilian and soldier. Dressed in uniforms, sworn to duty, yet unarmed, they occupied a space no one had defined. Some relayed coordinates for artillery. Others tended to air raid victims, while Flak scanned the skies for bombers. Each role tethered them to the machinery of war, yet stripped them of the protection civilians might claim. One former auxiliary reflected decades later, "We were neither innocent girls nor true soldiers. We belonged to a war that consumed everyone." Their memories, preserved through oral histories and memoirs, provide not just statistics of industrial defeat, but a human lens on its impact. They spoke of nights filled with the rumble of American armor, of mornings when fresh columns appeared as though conjured from the earth. They recalled the strange duality of terror and routine, typing reports as artillery thundered, boiling coffee as the ground shook, writing letters for wounded soldiers even as they awaited the next evacuation order. When the Reich finally collapsed, many auxiliaries carried home not medals, but a gnawing awareness of inevitability. They had witnessed the triumph of production over ideology, the slow grind of an enemy that seemed to have infinite strength. The legend of German invincibility had been shattered before their eyes, not by dramatic battles alone, but by the steady, unbroken advance of tanks and supply convoys. Their legacy, in the end, was not measured in victories but in survival, memory, and testimony. They became silent chroniclers of a truth that history would later confirm. Wars are not won by promises or propaganda, but by endurance, resources, and the relentless will to press forward. The American tank, as one put it, never slept, and in its tracks lay the remnants of the world they had been told was eternal. The dust of Normandy never truly settled in their memories. For the German auxiliaries who had watched St. Lo consumed by fire on July 18, 1944, the roar of American tanks became the sound of inevitability. Day and night, the engines rumbled forward, breaking through hedgerows, villages, and the illusions of a Reich that had promised them victory. In those hours of thunder and smoke, the future they had been raised to believe in collapsed into silence. Today, Historians no longer treat these women as mere footnotes. The Luftwaffe Flakhelferinnen, Wehrmacht clerks, nurses, and communication operators are acknowledged as integral to the functioning of Hitler's war machine. They were not strategists or generals, but they transmitted orders, tended the wounded, and filled gaps left by millions of men at the front. Their service exposes the full reach of total war. No corner of society remained untouched. No role left unconsumed. Their testimonies also reveal a paradox. They entered uniform with loyalty and discipline, often with youthful conviction shaped by propaganda. Yet many left the war disillusioned, burdened by images of burned villages, shattered comrades, and endless convoys of Allied tanks. One recalled, "We believed in triumph until the very end. Then the earth shook, and we knew it was over." The lesson lies not in their defeat alone, but in their recognition of the relentless weight of industrial warfare. America's tanks, rolling from Detroit's assembly lines, symbolized a power beyond ideology, a force that could not be outwilled or outdreamed. For the young women who once worked radios and manned searchlights, this realization came too late. Their war ended not with medals or songs of glory, but with a quiet reckoning that loyalty could not shield them from the truth. The camera returns to St. Lo. The ruins smolder, the horizon filled with columns of armor pressing forward. Amid the wreckage, the silence of realization lingers, an echo of engines that never stopped. And in that echo lies the final truth. Wars are not only measured in battles fought, but in the shadows of those who bore witness, and learned too late what steel and fire can do.